Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and a special welcome to those who are not professional philosophers in the audience. Knowledge Beyond Natural Science is a project we have at Stirling, funded by the John Templeton Foundation, to the tune of something like $1 million. So we better do well to deserve that money. This is part of the dedicated project activities, so you need to do well. A word or two about Carrie in a minute, but just about the shape of the occasion. Lecture for about 40 minutes, 3/4 of an hour, followed by 50 minutes or so Q&A. Then a chance to go rapidly to the bar, no more than about 15 minutes. Then we reconvene for the Café Philosophique, in which we have informal discussion around the group in general. And again, will be wine there too, so no panic about getting to the bar in between the two phases. So Carrie is Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia. She's been a colleague of mine, as it were, on and off for a number of years, a good friend to philosophy in Scotland. She was the first executive director of the RK Research Centre at St Andrews, and then joined us again at NIP as Professor of Theoretical Philosophy. Delighted to have her back associated with this project as a co-investigator. She has a very distinguished track record of research and publication in mainstream analytical philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, epistemology, metaphysics, her first book on philosophy of mathematics. But remarkably, she also has now a very well-developed research track on roughly the metaphysics of love, which is not a topic that many philosophers attend to, but which is actually deeply interesting and quite complex, I think. She has a new book on the topic. She has independently dedicated research money in Canada for this research, and we now get a glimpse of it. Her title of her new book is What is Love and What It Could Be, and the lecture today is precisely titled Knowing Our Own Hearts. So Carrie.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Crispin, for that lovely introduction, and thank you all so much for coming out on a Sunday evening to listen to some philosophy. So I'll just say a tiny little bit more to introduce myself and the kind of work that I do. So as Crispin mentioned there, I've been working on a project trying to investigate the nature of love, what it is, and also what it could be. So I don't want to be entirely beholden to what it is right now. I'm also interested in opening up expansive questions about what are the possibilities of what love could become in the future. And in fact, that's going to be one of the leading questions that I'm going to invite you to consider in the informal discussion section of this evening. I'm interested in romantic love primarily, not because I think the other kinds of love are not extremely interesting and important, but simply because in my mind romantic love raises some distinctive philosophical puzzles, and a lot of people seem to find it distinctively confusing in ways that I think it would be very useful and very beneficial to start thinking more carefully and more clearly about. And so, as Crispin mentioned, I have started a research project on the metaphysics of love. This is our lovely shiny website here. I want to acknowledge, as well as the support of the Templeton Foundation for this evening's activities, I have grants supporting this research from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and also the Government of Canada via my Canada Research Chair. So my book, What Love Is sort of the product of the first phase of my research program on this topic. And as I move into subsequent phases, I'm trying to bring more of what I do to a broader audience. So I'm particularly interested in finding ways to investigate and interrogate what romantic love is and what it could be that everybody can understand and get involved in. And one of the things that sometimes happens to me when I do this is that I come in front of public audiences, and the first reaction that tends to come up is, wait a second, you don't look like a philosopher. So I went to Google Images to check if it was true. And this is what I found. There is indeed a certain stereotype of what a philosopher looks like, and it doesn't look very much like me. This is not to say that we can't change that we can't push back on the stereotype, but I think it's very interestingly related to the fact that to date, philosophy in the traditions, in the analytic traditions that I work in, has been very much more concerned with looking at minds than with looking at hearts, with looking at thinking than looking at emotions. And I think that's part of actually why, as Crispin was saying in my introduction, the work that I have done on, say, the nature of mathematical knowledge has been considered to be mainstream, whereas the work that I'm now doing on the nature of love is considered to be non-traditional or radical, or even in some quarters scandalous. And incidentally, if that worries you, this might be a good time to escape. Before I really put you off philosophy forever. But in fact, love in all its glory, including in some cases its scandalous glory, has been at the core of philosophical inquiry since Plato. And actually, if you go back and read the Phaedrus or the Symposium, you will see that one of Plato's absolutely central concerns was the nature of love, what I would call the metaphysics of love. And that actually infected and informed all of his philosophical work in some very deep ways. So in some respects, the work that I'm doing now really represents a return to the origins of the traditions that I work in. In that spirit, I want to talk to you a little bit about knowing our own minds, about knowing our own hearts, and how we get to that question via thinking about knowing our own minds. Knowing our own minds is an issue that philosophers in the mainstream analytic tradition are very concerned with. And they're particularly interested in the fact that we seem to have a certain kind of special access to our own minds. Sometimes this is called privileged access, that we don't have to anyone else's. So I can just know whether I'm warm or hungry or tired without needing to ask questions about that. I just can tell, but I can't know the same thing about whether Sonia is warm or tired or hungry. I would have to ask her. Or maybe I can observe her behavior and figure it out, but I have a special kind of access to my mind, the way that I'm experiencing the world, whatever I'm thinking right now. This doesn't mean I can't be wrong. It still allows for error. Going back to Freud, we've been quite willing, I think, to acknowledge the possibility that some states of mind escape us, maybe in some sort of fairly deep ways. But there is something that's different about knowing our own mind as opposed to someone else's. And philosophers have developed various theories of how that might work. I will talk a little bit more about one of them later. There are also various skeptical challenges to this idea that we have special access to our own minds, which suggests that actually there may be nothing distinctive there at all. But what I want to do is ask whether, if indeed we have special access to our own minds, the same kind of access is possible with respect to our own hearts, to whether, when, and with whom we are in love. And again, I'm going to be looking at love in its distinctively romantic sense, because that's my philosophical topic of interest. Okay, so under the heading of knowing our own hearts, I want to start by acknowledging that this is hard. This is really hard, partly because there's very, very widespread disagreement, misunderstanding, and misinformation, I would go so far as to say, about what it means to be in love. So what are we even asking when we ask ourselves, am I in love? This means that communication failures are quite commonplace. It's not at all unusual to realize that someone has completely misunderstood one when having a very serious conversation about some of the most important things in our lives in this dimension. In my new work, some of which includes conducting empirical studies into what people mean by in love, I'm examining that phenomenon, the communication failure possibilities, in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But I want to start by taking a sort of philosophical angle on why that is happening. Why is there such widespread misunderstanding, and why are we sort of acquiescing in the fact that we don't really know what love is, that we're kind of content to just say it's an inexplicable mystery? And so this phenomenon whereby we're willing to say, yes, love is just so mysterious and wonderful, you can't really understand it, and you shouldn't try to understand it, you certainly shouldn't challenge it or try to critique anything about it. I have a word for that, I have a label for that. I call it the romantic mystique. And it's named after, for those of you who know your 1960s feminists, it's named after the feminine mystique, which was a term popularized by Betty Friedan for the bundle of ideas that became attached to womanhood and femininity in the, really way before the 1960s, but she was labeling it at that point as something that had happened by then. In fact, you can find pointers to this bundle of ideas earlier in the work of Simone de Beauvoir, who I'll also talk about a bit later on. But the idea was that the feminine mystique told us that women are mysterious and you can't really understand them, and there's something just sort of beautiful and magical about them. And as a result, there's no way that we could possibly understand them well enough to, for example, provide a comparable standard of medical care to the one that we provide for men. So, this is a problematic ideology in some ways. And I think the same is true of the same bundle of ideas as applied to romantic love. I think it's an invitation to throw up our hands and stop asking questions, right? And this is disempowering. It's an ideology telling us not to ask questions, not to overthink it. That's a phrase that we often hear, right, about love. Don't overthink it or you'll somehow ruin your chances. It's promoting ignorance. It's actively promoting ignorance and acquiescence in the status quo, whatever that might be. And you step one step below that, you'll see that means it's benefiting whoever is benefiting from the status quo. And this means it protects romantic love with all its attendant ideologies and in some cases stereotypes, including some interesting assumptions about gender roles that are appropriate in romantic relationships, for example. And it's leading those things to go unchallenged in a way that I think is deeply problematic. As a philosopher, this kind of thing just goes against everything that I stand for. I want to overthink everything, basically. I don't worry about overthinking. I think underthinking is by far the more prevalent problem in most of these cases. So my work is really all about dismantling the romantic mystique. So with a view to doing that, I've started to think about this question. Is romantic love something that comes to us from our biology? Is it something to do with instinct, something that's sort of an innate drive, maybe, that we have, as indeed some people have proposed? A very famous contemporary biological anthropologist called Helen Fisher, who's also an advisor to the dating service Match.com. She's extremely influential person, and she is very much in favor of the view that romantic love is all in the biology. It's just a human drive, a natural human drive, quite like hunger or thirst. Set in opposition to that, there's the view that romantic love is actually something that was invented a few hundred years ago in the literature and art of dominant European cultures. So it's basically more or less a social construct. Okay. On the biological side, you get mention of things like brain chemistry, so serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, all of those chemicals, and there's often a lot of emphasis on the evolutionary history of love as we currently experience it. So my question when I started out on trying to understand love a little better was, who's right? Right? Is it biology? Is it a social construct? Doesn't seem like brain chemistry is a social construct, so we're going to have to choose, right, one or the other. But this really bothered me because I was seeing a lot of wisdom in both halves of this apparent choice. So I was seeing a lot in the biological view that was of interest to me. For example, studies of where people who were reported being very intensely in love had their brain scanned, and they showed patterns of brain activation that were similar to the patterns that you would see in cocaine addicts. So this is actually a very interesting phenomenon because it can help us explain some of the behaviors that we associate with intense forms of romantic love. And I think if we were to just sort of throw the biology out of the picture, we would lose all of that. And I think it's actually very important to understand that we are naturally occurring phenomenon, right? We're human animals. We have biology. We do have an evolutionary history. But then on the other hand, I would be reading things that were suggesting to me that the biology was being overinflated, its role was being overinflated into something that I thought sounded more like what was actually invented a few hundred years ago in the literature and art of dominant European cultures. And this would include things like those gender roles that are now associated with romantic love. More on that in a little while. So basically what I found myself trying to do, and this is my current thinking on this is best represented in the book that I just wrote, is trying to find a way to make them fit together. And what I ended up with is the view that I call a dual nature theory of romantic love. And this is the idea that, you know, when you look at this picture here, and you say, well, who's that there? That's Captain Kirk, right? The character from Star Trek. That's a perfectly good answer, that's a true answer, it's a fine answer. Or you can look at that and say, that's William Shatner. You know, that actor, he played this role in a very famous TV series. Neither of those answers is wrong, right? And once we see the relationship between the actor and the role that he's playing, it doesn't sound weird to say that both answers are, in a sense, correct. I want to say the same thing about romantic love. What we have is a bundle of evolved neurochemical responses that go off in our brains. That's real, that's a phenomenon that actually happens. That's biology. It's kind of like the actor in this analogy. And then we expect those responses and reactions and the attendant feelings and behaviors to conform to a certain scripted role. And that is the analogy of the character of Captain Kirk. And for me, most, in fact maybe all of the most pressing philosophical questions arise precisely at the intersection of those two things, right? Is this basically a good casting decision? Can this kind of biology sustainably play the kind of role that we've written for it in modern society? Okay, so how good is the casting decision, and for whom is it a good casting decision? I think that's also an important question. So let me talk a little bit now about the, as it were, script, the normative expectations that we've developed around what romantic love or a romantic love relationship ought to look like. The way that we develop this script is through representation, right? We depict images, sometimes literally on TV or Google Images, which is, will deliver you lots of things that look like this. But also in, of course, the kinds of stories that we tell, and slightly less obviously in the kinds of lives that we live. All of those are ways of representing models of what romantic love looks like. I've chosen a selection of images here that will perhaps make clear to you that in some ways the kinds of depictions that we think of as normal or standard depictions of romantic love are quite uniform, right? There's a lot of similarities between what we see depicted, what we see represented. And as a result of that, we end up with what I've called the composite image of romantic love, developed out of all of those individual representations overlaid until certain contours emerge as guiding structural norms of what romantic love should be like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what those emergent contours are, but even just looking at the sort of images that we see here, you can see a couple of them, right? So, for example, there are two people involved. Normatively, they seem to be one of each of two genders, and there's lots of kissing in there, right? Now, if you think back to playground rhymes, does anyone remember so-and-so and so-and-so in a tree? K-I-S-S-I-N-G, right? First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in a baby carriage. Sounds so innocent. However, it's actually a theory of love. It's a theory of what love is, and in fact what love does in someone's life. It occupies a nexus between the physical affection stage and the marriage and reproduction phase, right? Kissing, first comes love, then marriage, then babies. That's a theory of love, and we're actually imbibing it before we've even really figured out what the words mean. Right? And in order to make the rhyme scan, we have to put two names in there, and typically it's one boy's name and one girl's name. And what we're getting there is a script, a normative script for what romantic love should look like. As soon as we have norms, we're going to start policing them. So as a result of this, we have ways of trying to make people conform to the normative picture. These are two very long words that are becoming more widely used, but they've come out of more philosophical discussions of the nature of love. At least this one has. So amatonormativity refers to the norm which says a romantic relationship is the best thing that life has to offer, right? A romantic relationship that looks more or less like the ones in the picture, that is what everybody should be aiming at. And the idea that you get as a result of this norm becoming standard, becoming normalized, is immense pressure on everybody who doesn't conform. So anybody who, for example, prefers or chooses to be single is going to be stigmatized as a result of amatonormativity. That word actually comes from a philosopher called Elizabeth Brake, who wrote a book called Minimizing Marriage in 2012, which discusses that phenomenon in some depth. On the other side of this picture, there's this norm of mononormativity, which is telling you, so amatonormativity is telling you get into a romantic relationship or you are sort of failing at life. Right? This is what happens, when you go to family dinners and people ask you, so when are you going to be settling down with someone? That's amatonormativity in action. Mononormativity is telling you, but don't get into too many of those. Okay, so just one romantic relationship, because romantic love is supposed to look like just two people together forever, right? That's how the script goes. And so as a result of this, we get this picture whereby these two norms have become the twin gutters in a bowling alley that are going to keep us all rolling down the same alley towards the same pins. And this is indeed a picture of what we now consider, and when I say we, I'm talking broadly about the sorts of social contexts that I'm familiar with, North American and British contexts. This has become what we think of as a normal picture of love, and everybody else has become a sort of deviant from the script. Okay. When I say normal here, I'm not talking about what's statistically normal. That's very important. What's normative and what's statistically normal can be actually very different things. Nevertheless, this is what we have as a sort of normative scripting at the moment. So when it comes to knowing whether one is in love, we are going to need to bear in mind that we're asking a question about something that is in part socially constructed in a way that, that involves this policing of different forms of love. So some forms of love are favored and encouraged, other forms are going to be disfavored and they're going to be discouraged. And this is going to impact what love does, how love plays out in people's lives. So for one kind of impact, it's going to be causal, right? So if you put up sufficiently many barriers to a kind of relationship, and you can see this in the history of, for example, interracial relationships. And I wish I could say that all of that was in fact history, although it's not. But you can see this kind of disfavoring, this discouraging, and eventually as a result of that, it gets so hard to maintain a real relationship that they end, or they're prevented altogether. So some kinds of love are actually causally impacted by the social norms. But there's another kind of impact as well, which I think of as more of a constitutive impact, because part of what's going on here is deeper, and it gets into our conceptual framework for understanding what it even means to be in love. And as a result of this, the kinds of people who don't conform to the script will commonly face people telling them they're actually not in love at all, right? They're not just discouraged, there's a refusal to accept that that could even count as love. And this, incidentally, is part of why I'm as interested in what love could be as in what it is right now. I think what it is right now is in some ways a quite limited phenomenon, but I think what it could be is potentially much more expansive, more inclusive. Okay, so this has all been so far about the metaphysics, the nature of love. I'm asking questions about what it is, and I have this dual nature theory. Along the way, I'm answering questions about whether it's real, yes, but it's a lot more complicated than some people tend to want it to be. And I'm also answering questions about things like whether it's natural, right, which is going to impact the question of whether it's biological or socially constructed. And, I end up with this sort of, bit of both as an answer to that question. But what I haven't talked much about yet is the epistemology. How do we know? Right? How do we know what love is? How do we know whether we are in love? And when I started thinking about that question, my first hope was, maybe I can leave it to the scientists. Can't someone else do it? Can't they just tell me what love is, and then I can read the studies? And no, unfortunately, it turns out if you read the current best science of love, which I tried to do, there's a very heavy methodological reliance on self-reporting in almost all of these studies. And what I mean by that is that when they're selecting subjects into the study, they're relying on what subjects tell them about whether they're in love or how much in love they are, or which of the symptoms of being in love they conform to. More about that in a minute. And then also, when they are looking for correlations between, say, people who say they're in love and bits of the brain that are more active or less active, they're using the self-reports again to identify those correlations. And they also use this when they're looking for correlations with other psychological factors like personality traits and things like that. Now what this means is that the science of love is relying on something that I think is going to be quite complicated by the fact that when we are asking questions about romantic love, we're not necessarily just asking about something that you can know by looking inside yourself, right? We're asking, in part, a question about this socially constructed phenomenon. When I looked at the science of love, my primary data points here were peer-reviewed studies that had been published between 2010 and 2015. So I wanted to look at recent stuff, not like back in the 1980s or what have you. And I was especially interested in, because that's where most of this stuff is, neuroscience and psychology. But there is stuff in other fields as well. What I was noticing was that although the studies were using self-reported love as their input, what was coming out at the other end were conclusions about love itself, the nature of love itself. And this struck me as being really worrying, because what we're putting in is just what people say, and what we're taking out is assuming that they're getting it right, that they're telling the truth, and that they know whether or not they're in love. And I think that's part of where the problem lies. Self-reporting is something that a lot of areas of scientific research rely on, and of course, there are lots of benefits. It's easy, for example. It's inexpensive. We normally expect people to know what's going on with them. And, there is a serious question about what else we're going to do if we don't just ask people whether they're in love. But there are also some, I think, fairly serious concerns, not least the kinds of effects that will bias the selection procedure. Now, in some of these studies, these were fairly obviously problematic. For example, in some of the studies, participants had been offered incentives, such as money or course credit, if they were students being recruited at the university where the researcher was based, to join the study. And the study was only accepting participants who said they were in love. So you've just incentivized a self-report that goes in one direction rather than the other. Different kind of worry. Subjects who self-report may not be representative of the full range. Some, for example, might be unaware of the fact that they're in love, right? We're not assuming it's possible to be 100% accurate on this kind of question. Some of them might be unwilling to talk about it, something else I'll come back to a bit later. And of course, plenty of them might just be unable to participate because they're too busy and don't have access to the study for whatever reason. These are all general concerns about self-reporting. We also, I think, ought to bear in mind the possibility of biases in self-assessment impacting reports concerning love in particular. Partly because, so we know, this is a well-established fact about us as humans, that we're prone to self-serving biases, so to rounding up our estimations of ourselves, to wishful thinking, right, so being more tempted to believe things that we would like to be true, and to confirmation biases, which lead us to discount evidence that goes against what we believe to be true. And the likely upshot of all of this is that we're going to be generally giving overly positive self-reports that ignore or discount any conflicting evidence. Now, thinking about how that kind of problem is going to impact studies of love, what I came to realize was that they're liable to end up being studies of comfortable, clear cases of love. So this is what I've sometimes called the CCC effect, the comfortable, clear cases. The comfortable cases are the ones that people are willing to talk about, right? So we're going to be selecting for people who are willing to reveal details of their personal lives to strangers in an anonymous survey. This might be predictably correlated with, say, psychological openness, lack of social awkwardness, lack of anxiety about discussing these things. But even more interestingly, there's going to be pressure not to report kinds of love that are considered wrong, right? Those kinds that are policed and disfavored in the social context in which they're occurring. So for example, we would expect to see same-sex love being underreported in conservative social contexts because people are just going to be scared to talk about something that they could get into a lot of trouble for. Okay, so those are the comfortable cases. The clear cases are basically the ones about which people don't feel confused. So if you're unsure whether you're in love, you are less likely to say that you are. That seems fairly straightforward, right? So this kind of self-report may be selecting for the confident types. Perhaps one might even say overconfident types, especially when we remember how very confusing love is as a subject matter. It's also important to bear in mind here that confidence might not just be tracking individual temperament, but also potentially differences in status and even social conditioning. So whether, for example, decisiveness is rewarded or penalized can depend on things like your gender. And so we may not be getting a fully representative sample for reasons like this as well. So another worry that I'm trying to keep in view here is that some people might be unaware that love is so much as possible for them given their circumstances. And this is a form of what epistemologist Miranda Fricker has called hermeneutical injustice. That's terminology which stands for this idea that we might be just not given the resources we need to describe our own situation. This is the way that she puts it. Prejudicial flaws in shared interpretive resources prevent the subject from making sense of an experience which it is strongly in her interests to render intelligible. So for example, queer people who only know pejorative words or concepts for their own orientation or relationships are in this situation. And they might not be aware, because of the social setting that they're in, that romantic love is a genuine possibility for a same-sex couple. So until, 20 years ago, a lot of the people I knew were in pretty much that situation. The CCC effect, the comfortable clear cases effect, impacts researchers, I think, as well as the subjects of research. So if, for example, coming back to that previous case, we still used a definition that was actually very common in 1970s philosophical work of romantic love as being love between a man and a woman, then studies like Ziki and Romana 2010 wouldn't exist. This is a study where the brain activation patterns of people in romantic love were mapped using fMRI scans, and they were tracking to see whether there would be any difference in the brain of someone whose partner was the same sex as them and someone whose partner was the opposite sex, and they found no difference, right? So in the brain, love looks pretty much the same, but you have to be conceptually on board with the idea that romantic love between a same-sex couple is possible before you can even conduct that study. And so this is the respect in which I'm worried about the compounding of these effects on self-reporting at the level of the researchers who are gathering up the self-reports. Contemporary studies are still typically investigating only monogamous cases of romantic love, and in fact, the standard measure of passionate love, of romantic love that's used is this passionate love scale that was created by Hatfield and Sprecher in 1986. Okay. Keep that date in mind, that's sort of important. But it includes, so it's a survey that's handed out to participants in the study to measure how in love they are, and it includes questions like, I'd rather be with X than with anyone else, and you're invited to say, how much do you agree with that statement? For X, your envisaged monogamous romantic partner, or X is the person who can make me feel the happiest, right? So if you are in love with two people, right, and you don't have one of them as your favorite one, then you're going to say no to questions like this, and that's going to bump you down the scale of how in love you are according to these studies, these researchers. But this scale from 1986 is still the most widely used measure of romantic love, despite being over 30 years old. So, the complexities of love in the time of Snapchat are plausibly not best accommodated by this kind of methodology. But things like this are extremely sticky, methodologically sticky, in the sense that researchers want, and in fact may need for academic reasons, their new work on love to be comparable to older studies. So they need to be able to say, has something changed as we've been tracking these things over time? How can we map our results onto previous results? And that's why these measures, once established, tend to remain firmly in place. Okay, onto the scandalous part of this talk. So here's a picture that will help explain some about why I care about that particular issue I was just discussing there. So this is me right here. This is my husband, Jonathan, and this is my other romantic partner, Ray. This is my boyfriend. Okay, so you might see why I'm sort of interested in the possibility of romantic love with more than one person being accepted as a genuine possibility. Here is that image. This was taken for the cover of the Chronicle of Higher Education review section, February 10 of this year. And I don't know if you can read this, it's a little bit small. I didn't have a high resolution image. But the headline here is, "Can Carrie Jenkins make polyamory respectable?" Polyamory is a word for the practice of ethical non-monogamy, having more than one romantic partner. And so, you know, no pressure or anything, but can I personally make this respectable? That to me was extremely interesting, partly because what that headline is telling me is that currently this is not respectable, right? I'm asked, can I change that state of affairs? Because at the moment, that's not how it is. This is not considered to be okay. And so, you know, the fact that the studies of love that are happening to date are mostly ruling out the possibility of this kind of love as a sort of matter of conceptual truth or a necessity is something that I'm very personally invested in, as well as philosophically interested in. Here's another data point on this. So I was on this the ABC Nightline program, which is sort of a bit like Newsnight or something like that in the UK, and they were reporting on the work that I'm doing and the fact that I am in multiple relationships, and this was reported as being something you normally think of as those trendy young West Coast types doing, but then they said, oh no, even these button-down Canadians are doing it. So, you know, there's something going on there. And I think what we're seeing here is an attempt to understand the fact that someone who presents as being quite a, you know, normal person might be doing something that is perceived to be extremely radical or scandalous in some way. Okay, just in case you're thinking no self-respecting philosopher would ever do such a thing, let me introduce you to this guy here. This is Bertrand Russell. He's the founder, or certainly a founder, of the analytic tradition of philosophy that I work in. In 1929, he published a book called Marriage and Morals, in which he argued, in fact, he was arguing that every relationship should be consensually non-monogamous. I think that's a little extreme. Personally, I'm in favor of letting everybody decide what they want to do, but nevertheless. He was also very open about his own non-monogamous relationships, and they informed his thinking and his writing on this subject. In 1940, he was appointed to a teaching position at the the City College of New York, and there was a public outcry and protests led by parents of, in fact, a parent of a student who was not eligible for his class. Nevertheless, his job was eventually denied, and there was a legal ruling that he was morally unfit to teach at that college. So I'm saying this partly just to ensure that we don't sort of sanitize or write out of the history of philosophy some important things about the people who were actually doing and studying these topics. Here's another person you may recognize. Anyone know who this is? So this is Simone de Beauvoir. So yeah, she was also openly non-monogamous with Jean-Paul Sartre. She's the author of The Second Sex, work of feminist philosophy, published in 1949. And one of the important inspirations, actually, for my work on the social construction of romantic love, partly because the way that she argued for gender as a social construct is inspiring to me as a way to argue for romantic love being a social construct as well. And in fact, I think the two are partly socially constructed in tandem. And I found a clue in just one small section of the second sex to the possibility that de Beauvoir might have thought so as well. And this is my favorite quote from her at the moment. On the day when it will be possible for a woman to love not in her weakness but in strength, not to abase herself but to assert herself, on that day love will become for her, as for man, a source of life and not of mortal danger. What she's seeing in love as she's experiencing it or understanding it around her in 1949 is a very, very gendered phenomenon. The constructs of romantic expectations are infused with expectations about gender roles within relationships. Okay, now when I say that I'm inspired by Simone de Beauvoir or by Bertrand Russell, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying they're my heroes. In fact, both of them were also morally awful in various ways. Russell was a huge racist and a eugenicist. Simone de Beauvoir seduced underage women students and all kinds of things. But being in open relationships was not one of the things that was morally awful about them. It was just a fact about what they did and who they were, and it infused their work. Okay, speaking of not sanitizing our stories or our histories, I want to think now about when we self-report or when we try to self-examine whether we're in love, when we try to know our own hearts in that sense, the possibility that we might be telling stories in two senses, right? One is this idea that we're invested in narratives that have a certain structure. The idea of a good life looking a certain way, a good love life looking a certain way. And I'm interested in that sense in which we try to tell a good story. I'm also interested in the idea that sometimes telling stories can amount to fibbing, right? Confabulating, rounding up. No, trying to tell a good story in the sense of trying to put your best foot forward and maybe sliding a little bit over the truth line. Okay, so that phenomenon that I mentioned, amatonormativity, that pressure to be in a romantic relationship can lead people to feel as if they fail at romantic love, they are somehow failing at life. I think this is actually a huge and underexplored problem with the current social construct of romantic love. It was one to which Bertrand Russell actually lent his full support, though. So in his 1929 book, Marriage and Morals, that I just mentioned, he said things like that, unless you've experienced this kind of love, then you can't attain your full stature. People like this cannot feel towards the rest of the world that kind of generous warmth, without which their social activities are pretty sure to be harmful. And it gets better, the resulting disappointment inclines them towards envy, oppression, and cruelty. So he's actually literally saying people who've never been in love are going to turn out to be really, really nasty people. That is a really, really nasty thing to say. Right? There are plenty of good people who are not looking for romantic relationships. That's not how they choose to live their life. Okay, so this pressure is very intense. Okay, and so some of the studies I looked at, for example, O'Leary et al. 2012, I think may have been infected with this pressure to tell a good story. So O'Leary et al. 2012, married subjects were asked how intensely in love they were with their partners, with their spouses. And the results, here's a quote from the paper, they said this was an unexpected result. The most frequent response was very intensely in love, right? With women at 46.3% and men at 49%. And notably, right, this is really notable, even for the very longest marriages of greater than or equal to 30 years, 40% of the women and 35% of the men still reported being very intensely in love. Oh my goodness! How is this happening? How are people not falling out of love? Well, I actually don't think that's terribly surprising, right? Because this is a study that was taking place in the US, and there's a strong social norm in cultures like this that if you are married, you are supposed to be truly, madly, deeply in love with your spouse forever. That's how it's supposed to go. That's the story that we're being pressured to tell. And so, you don't have to be being deliberately deceptive to think something like, well, oh my goodness, why would I have been with this person for 30 years if I didn't love him very much? I guess I've been with him for 30 years, so I must love him very much. So very intensely in love. Right? This is not at all an unusual thing for people to do. It's a normal kind of perhaps mild confabulation in some cases. Maybe some of them genuinely were still very intensely in love. But the point is, we can't really tell from that kind of result just what was going on there because of this enormous amatonormative social pressure. Okay, how am I doing on time? So I'm to talk about 40 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so I want to look at a couple more cases of research that I think may have been impacted by similar kinds of storytelling. So here's one. So there's a study, it's a little bit older than some of the others. Alexander and Fisher, 2003, was looking at gender differences in self-reported sexual behavior. And what they were noticing was that basically men were reporting more of certain kinds than the women were. But when the subjects were guaranteed anonymity, right, when they were not guaranteed anonymity, so, you know, the pressures to conform to social norms were intensified because it was going to be known what their answers were, potentially, those gender differences increased. And when they were told that they were going to be screened with a lie detector, which they apparently thought was a real thing, because apparently this is a cultural difference, and in the US some people still think that lie detectors work. I was really baffled by this. Anyway, when they thought that was going to happen, the gender differences decreased, right? When they thought they were under more pressure to be honest, the gender differences decreased. When they thought there was going to be potentially more social pressure, more oversight of what they were up to, the gender differences increased. And the hypothesis was that this was basically people reacting to social gender norms, what they thought they were supposed to say. So that was one instance of this sort of thing in action. Another one that I'm particularly fascinated by came in 2015 with this study by, and I'm sure I'm going to mangle the pronunciation here, apologies, but Wojcik et al., 2015, and this was a study titled Conservatives Report, but Liberals Display Greater Happiness. And so what they found was that the conservatives in studies, including theirs, but also some previous work, were displaying higher rates of self-reported happiness. Right? That if you asked them, how happy are you, they would say, yes, we're quite happy, and the liberals would say, well, you know, it's fine. But then they measured other things, like the frequency and genuineness of smiles in social media presence and the use of positively valenced vocabulary. And they found that by those other measures, not the self-reported measures, but by these other third-personal standards, they got exactly the opposite result. The liberals seemed happier from the outside, although they self-reported less happiness. One reason why that's going to be extremely, I think, important, potentially for the study of love, is that my most recent empirical work has suggested that happiness and love may be deeply interconnected, at least in people's minds, whether or not in reality. So this gap in the self-reported happiness levels, it turns out you could actually potentially account for all of that gap by looking at the self-enhancing style of self-reporting that is correlated with conservative political opinions. So they also track the fact that conservative people who were reporting conservative political opinions were more inclined to self-report in what they called self-enhancing style. And that would be enough to account for the entire difference that they were seeing between the self-reported happiness in the original studies. So, you know, all of this to me suggests, although we don't have anything like the equivalent of Wojcik et al. For love yet, we do have good reason to think that self-reporting is at least potentially susceptible to all kinds of social buffeting in ways that, to my mind, mean that I can't just let someone else do it, basically. I can't just read the science and hope that that will settle how we know about love. That's not going to work. So what can we do? So I've just recently started to conduct empirical work with some collaborators myself on current social attitudes to love. I'm going to talk about some of that a little bit later. So I'm very interested in the question of how we can make these studies better. What can we do that would be better than just asking people how in love they think they are and then saying that's how in love they are and look at the brain scans, right? So, I mean, there's basic stuff, right? Don't offer money to people to say that they're in love and then start studying them. That's sort of basic, right? Probably best not to conduct your survey only on undergraduates at one university, fine. Replicating the studies, that's actually, there's a huge crisis in social psychology generally at the moment on the question of how replicable most of the central stuff in the discipline might or might not be. Assuring subjects of anonymity and safety seems like a fairly basic one as well. But there's also some non-basics that turn out to be much harder to implement. So, I mean, of course, we'd like to avoid framing our questions in ways that build in assumptions, right? So, you know, if we could ask people how in love they are in a way that didn't require us to use a survey that projected our own assumptions about what it looks like when you are in love, that would be better. But how on earth are you going to do that, right? How on earth can you ask, how can you even use language that has no baggage? Right? All of our language has baggage. Everything that we say comes with certain ways of understanding how the world fits together. We can try to take a non-judgmental approach, but you have to make judgments. And so somewhere there's a line between what's judgmental and what's a judgment call, right? You have to decide you are or aren't going to study one thing or another. That's going to be a judgment call, but how can you tell whether you're being judgmental? I mean, you just have to know the moral facts. You just have to know whether your judgment is the right judgment or not. And that is not something that you can just solve by becoming a better scientist, or probably honestly even by becoming a better philosopher. That's just a huge problem that faces all humans. And even if we could do all of this, it wouldn't overcome all of the issues, because the kinds of extrinsic barriers to, for example, self-reporting socially disfavored kinds of love are still going to be there. If you're still worried that you might be outing yourself as someone who is involved in a practice that's considered to be scandalous and disgusting, you're going to, not mention it. So that means that social norms are still going to be shaping the results that we get, as well as impacting how our, for example, self-serving biases work. Or our confirmation biases, because those things are going to pick up on what we consider to be good results. So what we're told since the age of however young it is that we learn that rhyme about how love works, right? What we're told is a good result for love is marriage and babies. If you haven't got there yet, you're sort of, oh no, maybe it's not real love, because that's not fitting into the playground rhyme. And these kinds of things are going to impact how we understand a good life. And therefore, what will our confirmation biases or our wishful thinking deliver to us? Okay, so all of these things are problems. Now, does the upshot of this amount to everyone needs to write to Ben Goldacre and complain about how bad the science is, the science of love? I don't think so. In fact, I think a lot of the science is actually extremely useful and important. And we don't want to just throw it out and pretend that it all never happened. What I think we do need to do is to stop assuming that there's a single objective natural phenomenon around here whose nature is being illuminated by studies that are based on self-reports that are being impacted by these social norms. So when we are looking at something like romantic love, we are examining a partly socially constructed phenomenon. So when we look at these studies, we should just bear in mind that they're tracking all of these kinds of social pressures, all of this kind of social scripting. What we are learning about is partly socially constructed love. That's still really interesting, right? I really still care about what that is, what that looks like. But it is not something that is wholly natural as a phenomenon, wholly objective. It is something that's shaped by contemporary social norms. So really, one way of putting this is to say that the contemporary science of romantic love considered en masse is a sort of large-scale first-person plural self-report, right, where we're saying what we think love is, right? It captures, broadly speaking, how love is currently perceived and storified by a certain kind of us. And in this respect, I think it's telling us something about how to know our own hearts in a very collective and distributed sense, and not directly something about how to know our own hearts individually. But that might be okay, right? That might be okay, because the interesting phenomenon around here, I think, is something that partly resides outside of individual hearts and minds. It's partly a phenomenon that resides in the culture, the literature, the stories, the representations, etc. So, we approach all of this stuff with a certain amount of intellectual humility, because even understanding it for what it is, the enterprise is flawed, right? There is still, of course, problems with, for example, calibrating different people's reports and the ambiguity in the kinds of things that we're asking them to talk about. But, all human intellectual endeavor is flawed, so that's not a reason to give up. That's just a reason to be as careful as we can be. When we read studies in these headlines that come out of reporting that studies have just found that they can scan your brain and they can tell whether you're faking it or whether you're really in love. I mean, come on, that's extremely unlikely. And so as long as we're aware that what we're actually, you dig down past the headline and you dig into the studies, and it turns out that what that particular kind of headline is actually referring to is the fact that some people who went into brain scanners after self-reporting that they were very intensely in love tended to show a slightly different pattern of brain activation from some other people who didn't self-report that way. That's fine. That's still a very interesting result. But it doesn't mean that anyone's coming after you to scan your brain and take away your in-love credentials because they can now tell whether you're faking it. That's just nonsense. Okay, so for the last 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about some of the new work that I'm doing, trying as best I can to implement what I take to be the methodological and philosophical lessons of studying the research that's been conducted so far. I'm really interested in what we take to be evidence of love in other people and in ourselves, and whether there are differences between the two. Partly because I'm interested in that difference that shows up in the happiness research, right? And as to whether people who are self-reporting love might perhaps be tracking something a little different from what we might look at if we measured, happiness, self-reported happiness might be tracking something a little different from what we might see if we looked at happiness using other measures. Okay, so I'm interested in that question. Do we look for the same signs in other people as we might look for in ourselves? Some of the early indications suggest not. For example, when we're asked about other people, quite often the responses in our subjects, our study set, we're talking about things like their eyes and their face, right? Things that you see from the outside, or the fact that this person seems to be talking about someone all the time, right? It might be very easy to see that from the third-person perspective. Might not be so noticeable when you're doing it yourself. So I'm very interested in looking at this stuff and exploring the data points that we get, such as they are, acknowledging that we're looking at a socially constructed phenomenon, right? So we are in the business, I think, of examining a process of social construction. By looking at what people take to be the norms, the symptoms, the signs of love. What do we project onto other people? What do we look for in ourselves and self-report for ourselves? I'm really interested in this question of whether it might actually be easier to tell whether someone else is in love than whether we are ourselves. Okay, so I'll come to all of that later. All of this is to say I'm really looking at love's social dimensions. So this new work is done with some collaborators. Here they are. That's Nick Fitz, that's Natalia Washington, Chapman Waters. The work is still in progress, so I must emphasize this is not yet published research. We're doing the initial data analysis at the present time. So I'm showing you very much sort of live action as it develops, snapshots of our work in progress here. So what we did was we recruited 108 survey participants. They're all based in North America, different states of the US. And we asked them to provide free-form prose responses to questions, open-ended questions, including the most general open-ended question there is, what is love? We asked them to tell us their answers, and then we coded for various themes that came up in the answer distribution. So I'm not expecting you all to be able to read all of this now, but I'll tell you what some of these big ones here on the left are. The very popular themes. A feeling, right? That was really important. Some sort of feeling. This one here says intensifier adjective, so something that indicated intensity, like very or extremely or like highly or really, really or something like that. So something intense is going on. This one is about caring, bonding, and compassion, another very common answer. Something about connection and togetherness, commitments and altruism, attraction, passion, actually liking the other person, that came up in there, you'd be pleased to know. What you might notice over here is what I call the Hadaway effect, which is the tendency of people to say, baby, don't hurt me, whenever you ask what is love. This is a very genuine problem with trying to conduct serious research in this area. Everyone, of course, thinks that they're being completely original every time they do it. And then the song is stuck in your head for the rest of the day. It's an occupational hazard. We have to deal with it. Okay, so, but you'll also notice there's a very big spread here of different sorts of things that people are reporting. I mean, that in itself is a data point, right? There is not a straightforward agreement of any kind on just what we're talking about when we talk about what love is. You'll notice there's the MISC column here, quite a popular one. So even if even this is not the full range of symptoms of thematic continuities in the data when people were trying to just explain what they thought love was. We asked them, as well as that, we asked them, what is love like? And here we were trying to get them to expand on how they experience it for themselves. What's it like to be in love? And interestingly, we've got a slightly smaller, when we were coding, we saw slightly fewer patterns here. So there is a little bit more grouping together. Happiness is this big bar over here. So nearly 25% of our respondents are mentioning happiness in saying what they think love is like, what it's like to be in love. You're happy. Very interesting, especially given what we know about the happiness research and the impacts of self-reporting on that. This one here is warmth, excitement, relaxation, feeling calm, feeling comfortable. All of this stuff extremely interesting. That there is the MISC category again. So we still don't have complete uniformity, of course. But what we wanted to do is contrast that data set with this next one, which is for how you can tell when someone else is in love. And in this case, we get things like you look at their eyes, you look at their actions, it's something about their face. They've got a sort of glow, they light up. They're foolish. That was slightly more popular in this set than the other. Nobody reported that for the first person case, only the third person case. Right? You start acting really silly. But I don't start acting really silly. This person starts acting. When they are in love, they start acting silly. I, of course, just get very happy. But this top one here is happy or smiley. So you notice the other person smiling a lot, which again suggests that there's some really important connection being normatively, at least, projected onto what love looks like or feels like or should look like or should feel like. Right? Should make you happy. You should be happy if you're in love. You should be smiley. This one here is the column for talking about the other person all the time, right? Which is one of the interesting things that shows up in the third person data, but not in the first person reports. Okay, and again, we've got an other category here, just in case you thought that one had slipped out of the picture. No, it's still there. It's a lot of complexity in all of this stuff. And I mean, even, of course, our attempts to code this, we're picking out the themes that we researchers find in the data. And someone else looking at the same data might see or find different patterns. That's just a part of the very general fact that often gets overlooked in this kind of research, that the researchers are playing a huge role in shaping what's being studied. So, this is what we're seeing, and I'm sharing it with you with that caveat. Okay, last thing that I'll mention before I move into sort of trying to open up some discussion questions for later. One of the things I am most interested in, sort of motivating my entire interest in this field as part of philosophy and inquiry more generally, is this issue about how biological or social romantic love is, and whether we should think of love as being something that is driven biologically by, things beyond our perhaps rational control, and how much of it is sort of written into our genes, into our evolutionary makeup, and so on. And so I'm not just interested in the answer to that question in general, I'm also interested in what other people think about the answer to that question, because I think that's important. In our participant group, what we noticed was that the men were more likely to mention biology, in particular things like brain chemistry, in answering the question, what is love, than the women were. So that was an interesting fact, particularly in combination with this other fact, that the women were more likely than the men to agree with the claim that love is a free choice. So this is something that I think potentially might link back to the possibility that the romantic mystique is protecting certain kinds of gender stereotypes from examination and scrutiny. Particularly this idea that kind of motivates the romantic mystique, which just says that love is just going to happen and there's nothing you can do to challenge or change or critique it, and it's wonderful and perfect just the way it is. If you think that that is partly in place to preserve the current established order, like the patriarchal gender roles that are currently evinced in things like statistics for how likely women are to do most of the housework versus earning most of the income outside the home and things like that, then you can see why it might be more in the interests of the people benefiting from the patriarchal status quo to agree that love is just biologically determined and therefore uncritiquable and unchallengeable, including those gendered stereotypes. So this is at most a hypothesis about something that might stand behind some of these data, but I think it's a really interesting place to look for more clues about what it is that we're socially constructing and how and why. Okay, just to link this back a little bit to the ideas I was mentioning right at the beginning about theories of how it might be that we have special access to our own minds and not to other people's. One of the types of theoretical approach to that question is called broadly an agentialist theory, which means the reason we have more access to our own minds is partly because we are the agents of our own minds. We are able to perform, for example, intentional actions. So I deliberately decide to go and pick up this cup right now. And in so doing, I'm not just waiting to see whether I'll decide to pick up the cup or whether I want to pick up the cup. I'm actually doing it, right? I'm deciding, and I'm making an agential choice, an active choice to pick the cup up. And so that's the reason why I can tell, in a way that I can't necessarily tell what Sonia's intentions are right now, what my own intentions are, right? It's because I'm actually doing them. It's part of the package that I would get that sort of information. Now, if love is a free choice in the sense of being something that we decide to do as agents, rather than something that happens passively to us while we sort of stand by and hope to fall in or out or whatever it is that we want to have happen to us, then we might be able to give a theory of knowing our own hearts that goes via this agential feature of what love is. But that would depend on questions like whether love is in fact a free choice or something that is, with respect to which we are at the whims of biology. Okay, so I'm going to start now to open up a few of the possible questions we might like to consider in the informal part of this evening over a nice glass of wine in the area sort of around that corner over there. So I think it would be great to have a think about whether romantic love is biological or socially constructed, perhaps both, perhaps neither. And I didn't talk very much about this this evening, but you might be able to see for yourselves that the answers to questions like that are going to bear on what the future of love might look like quite heavily, right? If love is in fact a social construct, we can change it by changing our social practices or our social norms. If it's biological, can't change it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean we can't change it at all, because after all, we don't normally think that anything that's built into our biology is therefore something that we just have to accept forever, right? I mean, being eaten by a bear is quite a biological process, but we don't just go, oh no, okay, I'm being eaten by a bear, never mind. We can, we can change things, even if they are biological, but what we would do if we wanted to change the nature of love would be very different in the two cases, if it's biological or if it's a social construct. And of course, the question of whether we should want to is very much up for grabs. I'm interested in this question of whether knowing one's heart is like knowing one's own mind. And I've been sort of proceeding as if there were some overlap there and potentially some differences, because I'm thinking knowing one's own heart involves knowing facts about social life, but maybe knowing one's own mind does as well in some ways. I think that would be an interesting question to pursue as well. I would love to know why happiness keeps showing up in the data the way it does. Are love and happiness so intimately linked as our US survey participants seem to think? Is it easier to tell when someone else is in love than when you are yourself? What are the signs and symptoms in each case? Are we even tracking the same thing? Are we projecting onto someone else the same thing that we are looking for in ourselves? What can researchers do to better understand and study love? I've talked a little bit about the morals that I've drawn out of the current issues with looking at these questions, but there are many more problems that remain, and I would love to know any answers that anyone has to that question. Couple that sort of draw back on the history of the philosophy of love. In one of Plato's dialogues, the Phaedrus, Socrates, the character of Socrates, as written by Plato, says love is a kind of madness. But he then sort of retracts and says, well, no, but it's a beneficial kind. It's a good kind. So I'm interested in whether he's right about that, and more generally how love relates to rationality and irrationality. And I think this is actually really important for understanding its connection, its complicated relationship to the history of philosophy, which is itself bound up in quite difficult ways with questions about rationality and irrationality. Bertrand Russell, he once said that love was wise, so I'm wondering if he's right about that. And if he is right about that, again, thinking about the nature of philosophy as a discipline, what on earth do wisdom and happiness have to do with each other, if anything? Okay, so you can of course talk about anything else that you want to, but those are a few suggestions, and just to finish up, I want to say thank you all again for listening. If you want to find more about me, I'm in all the usual social media type places. If you want to learn more about the project here and the work that we're doing, you can find us on the web or on Twitter and Facebook. And thank you all very much for listening.
Yes, okay. Yeah, we're deciding we're going to skip the Q&A. I will say something though. I've often been asked, do you love me? By my partner, and if I were to reply, well, that's actually a theoretically very complex question. So let's go through and have.
So I can tell you a bit about what will happen next. So the plan is for us to move. There's a room set up down the hall that has tables. The idea is to have small groups of maybe 5 or 6 people. There's wine there. The plan is to have small discussions that are led by project members here, sort of based on these last few slides. And then we'll come all together and Carrie will answer some general questions that arise from those discussions. So
when you say answer, I mean respond to.
The room is
up the corridor, just follow it.
Up the corridor.
That
So
way.
we'll be going that way. So just follow along. There's wine set up there. We'll talk for half an hour or so in small groups, and then maybe a little bit longer all together. Great. So come along.